Hi everyone. Today I'm excited to share a short empirical research study titled Divided We Fall: The Economic Costs of Political Polarization in the US. In recent years, it's become increasingly clear that political polarization is shaping not just the tone of our conversations, but the function of our institutions. In this project, I wanted to ask whether those political divisions might also be affecting something else, our economic performance. Specifically, I look at whether partisan polarization at the state level is associated with slower GDP growth, especially in moments of crisis like the year 2020. To begin, let's talk about why this question matters. We often hear about polarization eroding social trust, gridlocking legislatures, or undermining democratic norms. But what if it also impacts the economy? In economic terms, polarization may act like uncertainty. In the private sector, uncertainty discourages investment, slows hiring, and raises costs. In government, the same logic might apply. A polarized state government may struggle to pass effective budgets, implement timely aid, or coordinate cross-party responses during a crisis. Despite this intuitive logic, the economic consequences of polarization are still relatively understudied. That's the gap I'm hoping to begin exploring with this project. So that brings us to the central question of this study. Does greater partisan imbalance reduce GDP growth at the state level? The core idea is this. When a state is highly polarized, it may experience weaker collaboration between parties, less effective governance, and lower trust in institutions. These conditions could suppress economic activity, particularly in moments when fast, unified responses are needed. That makes 2020 an ideal case study. Not only was it a crisis year due to the pandemic, but it also revealed sharp differences in how states approached public health, stimulus, and regulation. So now let's move on to my hypothesis. My hypothesis going into this analysis was straightforward. I expected that states with higher levels of political polarization, so defined as a larger gap between the share of Democrats and Republicans, would show slower economic growth in 2020. This effect would likely be amplified during periods of national disruption. So COVID-19 created a massive economic shock, but it also forced states to take the lead in managing public health, business closures, and local relief. My thought was that polarization might have hindered effective coordination, ultimately affecting the pace of economic recovery. So, to test this hypothesis, I used two main data sources. So, the first was the 2020 Cooperative Election Study, a large-scale political survey that provides detailed political affiliation data by state. From this, I calculated each state's polarization index, which I'll explain in just a moment. And then the second source I used was the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, which tracks real GDP growth for each state. I specifically used the change in real GDP from 2019 to 2020 to capture the economic impact of the first full year of the pandemic. So now let me move on to my methodology. With these data sets, I constructed what I'm calling a polarization index. This index simply measures the absolute difference between the percentage of Democrats and Republicans in a given state. The larger the gap, the more ideologically skewed and therefore more polarized the state is assumed to be. I then merged that polarization data with the GDP growth figures and ran a linear regression. The equation is simple. GDP growth equals a baseline plus a coefficient times the polarization index plus an error term. I'll note here that this is a very minimal model. It's bivariate, meaning it doesn't include controls for other factors like unemployment or the governor's political party. That's intentional for now. The goal is first to see whether there's any clear pattern in the raw data. So let me move on to my results. So what did I find? The short answer is not much. The coefficient on polarization was negative 0.002, indicating a slight negative relationship between polarization and GDP growth, but unfortunately it was not statistically significant. The p-value was 0.89, which is far above the threshold where we consider this a meaningful result. Even more telling, the adjusted R squared was negative. This means that the model actually explains less variation in GDP growth than a simple average would. In other words, polarization did not appear to be a meaningful predictor of state economic performance in 2020. Now let's just move on to visual evidence. The scatter plot helps visualize what I just described. Each dot represents a state. The x-axis shows that state's polarization score, and the y-axis shows its GDP growth from 2019 and 2020. As you can see, the points are broadly scattered with no clear trend. The regression line is nearly flat, which reflects the fact that there's no strong relationship in the data. Some highly polarized states saw large contractions, others didn't, and the same is true for less polarized states. So, from both a statistical and visual standpoint, there's little support for the idea that polarization drove short-term economic performance in that year. Now, let's just look at the interpretation and limitations. Now, it would be easy to look at this and say, well, polarization doesn't matter, but I want to offer a few reasons why we should be cautious in jumping to that conclusion. First, the effects of polarization may be more long-term than immediate. 1 year of data may not be enough to capture its full economic consequences. Second, GDP is just only one metric. Polarization may have more visible effects on other outcomes such as employment, consumer confidence, small business activity, or even migration patterns. Third, 2020 was an unusually noisy year. The pandemic hit different states at different times and in very different ways. Federal stimulus measures, infection rates, and lockdown policies varied enormously. It's possible that any relationship between polarization and economic performance was simply overwhelmed by other dynamics. And finally, this was a simple model. With no control variables, we can't rule out the possibility of omitted variable bias, including things like unemployment, state fiscal health, or institutional trust could help reveal more complex patterns. So, for next steps and policy implications, looking ahead, there are several ways to build on this research. First, extending the data set across multiple years would allow us to observe long-run trends and determine whether polarization has a cumulative effect on economic resilience. Second, adding control variables such as the party of the governor, legislative deadlock, unemployment rates, and institutional trust could help better isolate the effect of polarization itself. Third, future work could examine outcomes beyond GDP. For example, do polarized states receive less federal funding? Do they see more economic volatility? Are businesses less likely to invest in polarized environments? And answering these questions could help policymakers better understand where polarization matters, where it doesn't, and how to build institutions that can function effectively even in divided times. So, in conclusion, while this analysis didn't uncover a significant short-term effect of polarization on GDP growth, it raises important questions about the relationship between political division and economic resilience. In a country as politically fragmented as the US is right now, it's crucial to understand not just the social consequences of polarization, but the economic ones as well. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening.